What would it take to reach someone who'd built walls so high that no one could get through? Alexander Knight, the youngest self-made billionaire in New York's tech industry, was known for three things: his brilliant mind, his ruthless business tactics, and his complete inability to connect with other human beings. He spoke only when necessary, avoided all social situations, and had mastered the art of making people feel invisible with a single cold glance. Then he met Maya Rodriguez, a barista with an incurable habit of talking to everyone about everything, who refused to accept his silence as rejection. What happened between the man who wouldn't speak and the woman who wouldn't stop talking became the most unexpected love story Manhattan had seen in years, proving that sometimes the people who seem most unreachable are simply waiting for someone brave enough to keep trying. Alexander Knight's office occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower in downtown Manhattan, a space designed with the same cold efficiency as the man himself. At 32, he built Knight Technologies into a $5 billion empire, revolutionizing data encryption through innovations that made him wealthy beyond imagination and completely isolated from normal human interaction. His employees described him as brilliant but impossible, someone who communicated primarily through terse emails, conducted meetings with brutal efficiency, and had perfected the art of making people understand they were dismissed without saying a single word. He had no friends, no romantic relationships, and no apparent interest in acquiring either. The truth about Alexander that no one in his corporate world knew was far more painful than simple coldness. He'd grown up in foster care after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. He'd been shuffled through 11 different homes in 11 years, learning early that attachment led to loss, and that protecting yourself meant keeping everyone at a distance. By the time he aged out of the system at 18, he developed a fortress around his heart that made emotional connection feel dangerous rather than desirable. He poured everything into academic achievement and eventually entrepreneurship, finding safety in code and business logic where human emotions couldn't hurt him. His success was extraordinary, but it was built on a foundation of profound loneliness that he'd convinced himself was strength. Alexander's daily routine was mechanical and precise. He woke at 5, worked out alone in his penthouse gym, and arrived at his office by 7. But there was one deviation in his otherwise isolated existence. Every morning, he stopped at a small coffee shop called Sunrise Cafe 3 blocks from his office. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, no conversation, and the staff had learned to simply prepare it when they saw him approaching. For 2 years, this transaction had occurred without variation. Alexander entered. A barista handed him coffee. He paid. He left. No words exchanged beyond "thank you" delivered in a tone that discouraged any response. It was the closest thing to human interaction in his day, and he preferred it to remain transactional and impersonal. Then Maya Rodriguez started working at Sunrise Cafe, and Alexander's carefully controlled routine met an unstoppable force. Maya was 26, working as a barista while finishing her master's degree in social work, and she possessed the rare quality of being genuinely interested in every single person she encountered. She asked customers about their days, remembered their names and orders, shared stories about her own life, with the unself-conscious openness of someone who'd never learned that vulnerability was dangerous. Her coworkers found her exhausting. Her professors called her refreshingly authentic, and her friends described her as someone who could start a conversation with a wall and somehow make the wall respond. On Maya's first morning working the opening shift, Alexander entered at his usual time expecting his usual silent transaction. Instead, he was greeted by a bright smile and an immediate stream of conversation. "Good morning. You must be Alexander. Katie told me you come in every day at exactly 7:15 and order black coffee, which honestly I respect because it means you actually like coffee for coffee and not just as a vehicle for sugar and milk, you know? Amaya, I just started here, and I have to say your coat is amazing. Is it cashmere? It looks incredibly warm and also very sophisticated, which seems like the perfect combination for this weather. So black coffee coming right up. Do you have any big meetings today? You look like someone who has important meetings." She said all of this while preparing his coffee, barely pausing for breath, her hands moving efficiently even as words poured out in an unstoppable stream. Alexander stood frozen, utterly unprepared for this assault of friendliness. He took his coffee, managed a stiff "thank you," and fled the cafe, his routine shattered by someone who apparently hadn't received the memo that he was unapproachable. For the rest of that day, he couldn't stop thinking about the bizarre encounter, annoyed with himself for being distracted by a talkative barista who clearly had no concept of professional boundaries or appropriate customer service restraint. He considered finding a different coffee shop. He considered sending a complaint to management. But the next morning, he found himself walking into Sunrise Cafe at exactly 7:15, telling himself it was simply because changing routines was inefficient. Maya greeted him the second morning with the same enthusiastic energy. "Alexander, you came back. I was worried maybe I talked too much yesterday and scared you off, which my roommate says I do sometimes. But I figure if people want me to stop talking, they can just say so, right? Although I guess some people are too polite to say so, which means I should probably read social cues better, but honestly, I'm not great at that. Anyway, black coffee again. I actually researched coffee origins last night because I was curious. And did you know that coffee was discovered by goats? Like, a goat herder in Ethiopia noticed his goats got really energetic after eating certain berries, and that's how humans discovered coffee. Isn't that amazing? We owe our entire coffee culture to hyperactive goats. Despite himself, Alexander felt the corner of his mouth twitch, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one in recent memory. He took his coffee and left without responding, but this time he wasn't annoyed. He was puzzled and slightly intrigued. Maya's complete lack of awareness regarding social hierarchies and professional distance was so foreign to his world of calculated interactions that he found it almost fascinating. She treated him like a regular person rather than a billionaire CEO whose coldness had made assistants cry. She filled his silence without demanding he fill it himself, never seeming offended by his lack of response or deterred from trying again. This pattern continued for weeks. Every morning, Maya greeted Alexander with genuine warmth and launched into stories, observations, or random facts, never seeming bothered by his minimal responses. She told him about her studies and social work, her dreams of opening a community center for at-risk youth, her complicated relationship with her large Puerto Rican family who couldn't understand why she was still in school instead of married with children. She asked him questions he didn't answer and then answered them herself with guesses about his life that were sometimes surprisingly accurate. She shared her struggles with student debt, her fears about whether she was actually good enough to help people, and her belief that everyone had stories worth hearing if someone took the time to listen. Alexander began looking forward to these morning encounters in ways that confused and slightly alarmed him. He started arriving a few minutes early to ensure he had time for Maya's morning monologue without being late to the office. He found himself thinking about things she'd said throughout his day, her passionate description of a client she'd helped at her internship, her hilarious story about her nephew's birthday party, her thoughtful observation about how people built walls to protect themselves and sometimes forgot how to take them down. He realized she was describing him in that last comment, though she'd framed it as a general observation about human nature rather than a direct call-out of his isolation. One morning in late autumn, Alexander arrived to find Maya crying silently while preparing orders, trying to hide tears that were obviously the result of something devastating. Every instinct told him to take his coffee and leave. Other people's emotions were exactly what he'd spent decades avoiding. But something made him pause. Something made him set down his briefcase, walk to the counter, and ask in a voice rough from disuse in personal conversations, "What's wrong?" Maya looked up, startled that he'd spoken beyond his usual monosyllabic responses. "My program director told me I'm too emotionally involved with clients, that I need more professional boundaries or I won't survive in this field. But if I stop caring, if I create distance, how am I supposed to actually help people? Isn't the whole point to connect with them?" Alexander understood something in that moment that he'd been avoiding acknowledging. Maya wasn't just talkative or oblivious to social cues. She was courageously vulnerable in a world that punished vulnerability, intentionally open in spaces where others built walls, and committed to connection even when connection was risky and painful. Everything he'd told himself was strength, his isolation, his emotional control, his refusal to let anyone close, suddenly looked like cowardice compared to Maya's daily choice to stay open despite how much it hurt sometimes. She was everything he wasn't, and everything he'd secretly been wishing he could be before he'd forgotten how to wish for anything beyond professional success. "Your program director is wrong," Alexander heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere deep he'd locked away years ago. The world has enough people with professional boundaries. It doesn't have enough people who actually care. Don't let them make you like everyone else. Maya's tears stopped, her expression shifting to wonder as she processed that the silent man who'd barely acknowledged her existence for months had just offered her exactly the validation she needed. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than you know. Alexander nodded, took his coffee, and left, his heart pounding with the unfamiliar sensation of having let someone matter to him. After that morning, something shifted. Alexander started responding to Maya's questions. Brief responses at first, single sentences, but actual engagement rather than silence. He learned about her family, her work, her dreams. She learned about his company, his foster care background that he'd never told anyone, his fear that success was all he'd ever have because he'd forgotten how to let people in. Their morning conversations stretched from 5 minutes to 15, then to 30. Alexander started arriving earlier, staying longer, and Maya started saving topics specifically to share with him, lighting up when he walked through the door in ways that made other customers smile at the obvious affection developing between the withdrawn CEO and the irrepressibly warm barista. The shift from friendship to something more happened gradually, then suddenly. Alexander found himself thinking about Maya constantly, rearranging meetings to ensure he didn't miss their morning time, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in decades. Maya, who'd approached Alexander initially with her standard openness to everyone, realized she'd fallen for the brilliant, damaged man who'd slowly let her see past his walls to the loneliness and longing underneath. The morning Alexander finally asked her to dinner, awkwardly, formally, like someone who'd never asked anyone on a date before, which was essentially true. Maya said yes with tears in her eyes and a smile that made him understand why people write poetry about love. Their relationship was unconventional from the start. Maya refused to be intimidated by Alexander's wealth or status, treating him like a regular person who happened to be extremely successful rather than a billionaire to be impressed by or exploited. She dragged him to family dinners where her enormous extended family subjected him to interrogations, affection, and the novel experience of people caring about him for reasons unrelated to his business value. She taught him how to be vulnerable, how to express emotions he'd buried for decades, how to accept love without assuming it would be taken away. She challenged his workaholism and isolation while respecting the brilliance and drive that made him successful. Alexander, in turn, supported Maya's dreams in ways beyond financial contribution. He used his connections to help her find internship opportunities with the best social work programs in the city. He attended her presentations and graduation when she completed her master's degree. He helped her open the community center she'd dreamed about, not by simply funding it, but by listening to her vision and helping make it reality while ensuring it remained hers. He learned that loving someone meant celebrating their independence and supporting their growth, not controlling or possessing them. Maya taught him that strength wasn't isolation. It was having the courage to be vulnerable with someone who'd earned your trust. According to research on attachment and adult relationships, people who develop avoidant attachment styles due to childhood trauma often struggle with intimacy and connection throughout their lives unless they encounter relationships that feel safe enough to risk vulnerability. Maya provided that safety through consistent presence, unconditional acceptance, and refusal to be deterred by Alexander's initial walls. She didn't try to fix him or save him. She simply kept showing up, kept being authentically herself, and kept inviting him to join her in connection rather than isolation. That patient, persistent invitation was what finally allowed Alexander to risk opening his heart. The business world was baffled by Alexander's transformation. The cold, ruthless CEO became someone who smiled, who attended company social events, who implemented employee wellness programs and family leave policies that prioritized people over profit margins. His leadership style shifted from authoritarian efficiency to collaborative engagement, and somehow the company became more successful rather than less. Employees who'd feared him began to respect him, understanding that his previous coldness had been armor rather than his true nature. Alexander Knight, the man who'd ignored everyone, became known as someone who actually listened, who cared about his team's well-being, and who understood that success meant nothing without connection and purpose. 2 years after their first meeting at Sunrise Cafe, Alexander proposed to Maya in the most unexpected way. He started talking. For 30 minutes straight, he told her everything he'd never said to anyone. Every fear, every hope, every way she'd changed his life, and taught him that love wasn't dangerous. It was the only thing that made existence meaningful. He told her about the boy who'd learned to survive alone and the man who'd almost forgotten what it meant to be human until a talkative barista had refused to accept his silence as an answer. And then he asked her to marry him, promising to spend the rest of his life being as brave about connection as she'd always been. This story reminds us that the people who seem coldest are often the ones who've been hurt most deeply and built the highest walls to protect themselves from further pain. Alexander Knight wasn't naturally cold or unfeeling. He learned to survive by suppressing vulnerability and avoiding attachment. Maya didn't change him by forcing or fixing him. She simply kept showing up, kept being authentically warm and open, and created a space where it felt safe enough for Alexander to risk letting someone in. That's what love often looks like. Not dramatic rescue or transformation, but patient, consistent presence that invites someone to choose connection over isolation. That Maya's superpower wasn't her talkativeness. It was her courage to stay vulnerable and authentic in a world that often punishes those qualities. She refused to let Alexander's coldness make her cold, refused to let his silence her, and refused to accept that his walls meant he didn't want connection. She saw past his armor to the lonely person underneath and kept inviting him into relationship even when he seemed to be rejecting the invitation. That kind of persistent compassion changes lives, not by forcing change, but by making change feel possible. The lesson here isn't that lonely people need someone to save them, or that persistent attention will always break through emotional walls. It's that authentic connection requires courage from both people. Courage to stay open despite risk, and courage to accept openness despite fear. Alexander and Maya both had to be brave in different ways to create the relationship that transformed them both. He had to risk vulnerability after years of isolation. She had to risk rejection while staying authentic despite his initial coldness. Together, they created something neither could have built alone. That if this love story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about unexpected connections and the power of choosing vulnerability over self-protection. Comment below about times when someone's persistent kindness broke through your walls, or when you refused to give up for someone. And if you're the one behind walls, let this story remind you that the right person won't be deterred by your armor. They'll just keep knocking until you feel safe enough to open the door. Red Heart.